Hello, everyone, and welcome to Wisdom Seeker Live podcast. We are just about into November and looking for uh, the year winding down. A lot to think about, a lot to consider, and glad to have everyone with us. And hope that you will let us know where you're joining from. And as always, we want to let you know about how we see wisdom as part of the wisdom seeker approach. It is a journey that we experience. The journey starts with gaining knowledge, knowledge being facts, figures, information that we pick up either informally or formally. The key is, though, that we don't need to stop with knowledge. Unfortunately, we're in a culture that seems to value knowledge more than other things, and it is causing some challenges. But knowledge is the first step, it is not the end, though. Second step in the wisdom process is to gain understanding. And that's when we take our knowledge that we have picked up along the way and we use it, we apply it, and we make it personal. It becomes part of who we are, what we do, how we behave, and so on. And that is where we begin to grow and mature in that understanding. And it's also where we are actually truly learning, is as we get into understanding. And then the third step in the process, which is really the most critical step, is going into wisdom. And wisdom is where we take our knowledge and our understanding and we see it from a much bigger perspective. We see it outside of ourselves. We see it how that our knowledge and understanding, how we use it, affects not only us, but other people, the world around us, and the bigger world. It's all part of the process that we go through to gain wisdom. And for those of us that have a spiritual bent, we look at wisdom ultimately as seeing things through God's eyes and understanding it from His perspective so that we behave in a way consistent with His design for us. So, welcome to our podcast for today. Welcome, Jane and Lydia. Glad to have you today and joining in with us. And what I wanted to do today was to revisit the original topic that we started the Wisdom Seeker Live podcast with coming up on 2 years ago. And that is the 40-day challenge. And for those of you that weren't there or haven't heard about the 40-day challenge, it is a challenge I issued to everyone that is interested in seeking wisdom, because I believe that this challenge helps us to get into a process or a habit that will help us in gaining wisdom and to grow in ways to be present. Welcome, Atakur. Glad to have you. If I mispronounce your name, please give me a correction, but welcome aboard. Glad to have you. So what is the 40-day challenge that I'm talking about? What I issued, like I said, January will be 2 years ago, and our first podcast is a way for us to be intentional in gaining wisdom. Because we will all gain wisdom on some level with enough time, if we unless we resist gaining that wisdom. But what we want to do is that we want to take a practice, or have a practice, if you will, of doing something that helps us to get to a point where we gain wisdom in a practical or level, on a practical level in our lives. And the process is that we began with disconnecting. And as things get really crazier in our world, We've got challenges with the economy. We've got war going on in the over in the Ukraine and Russia, and we've still trying to figure out what's happening from the pandemic. We've got just so many things going on that are pulling at us or vying for our attention. And so we need to disconnect. And I believe that one way, especially to disconnect, has to do with involvement in media, especially in news media. Right now, we are inundated with so much so-called news, which is a question mark. It is more about, in my opinion alone, about editorializing and affecting opinions rather than reporting them. But that notwithstanding, what we disconnect from is going to vary from person to person. It could be that we need to disconnect from some behaviors that we're involved in. Whatever that looks like for each individual is key. So make a choice to disconnect. That disconnect could be a matter of a few minutes, could be a matter of hours, could be days, or it could be a permanent disconnect. I know for me, I made a choice a few years ago to disconnect permanently from the watching news, because I found that it created a lot of distraction. It also created anxiety and created challenges that I really didn't find needful. Now, please understand, as I disconnected, it wasn't that I am unaware or that I'm hiding from the realities that we face in the world. I'm just limiting the exposure I have, especially in light of what I can control and influence. And so our first step in this 40-day challenge is to decide what we need to disconnect from. And again, each individual is going to make their own choice, but I encourage you to be very intentional in that choice. And I would encourage you to consider only one thing rather than trying to disconnect from many, many things, as Anton and I talk about on our Tuesday podcast, that we don't need to try to make wholesale changes. The key is what we call 10%. Make a first step, a small step. Welcome, Leslie. Glad to have you with us today. So, first step in this 40-day challenge is to disconnect, whatever that looks like for you. But it's important that in addition to disconnecting, that you replace that time with another behavior, and that's observing. And that is something that we don't do often enough. Unfortunately, many of us are in kind of autopilot mode, and we are going through the motions, and to a point that we are not aware of what's going on around us. So as we disconnect, it will give us time and opportunity to begin to observe. And the key here is that we need to observe inwardly and outwardly. And for many of us, that observation needs to be more focused on what is going on, or we observe right around us in our own life, in our own world. It's easy to get caught up in observing the bigger picture world, which I appreciate that has some value. But at the end of the day, much of those things we can't do anything about. We can't control it. We can't influence it. So exposing ourselves to it is not only has limited effectiveness, but quite often can create challenges. So first step, disconnect. Second step, observe. Rick, welcome. Glad to have you as always. So we're talking about a 3-step process. And the third step in this process is then, once we begin to observe, see what's going on in us and around us, then we need to be very intentional to seek wisdom in what we are observing. And that becomes so important. Okay, because if we observe things that we could learn from, but we don't make the step to seek wisdom in those things, then we're missing the biggest, most important part of the process of this 40-day challenge. So we are talking about disconnecting whatever it is that is a major distraction for us in our life, whatever that is, or possibly whoever it is. Depends on your situation, but be very intentional and make a very thoughtful choice about what you're going to disconnect from. Secondly, then begin observing. As Leslie puts, way she puts it, is to reflect. And that is another good word for what I'm talking about. Reflecting on what's going on inside us and outside us. And then the last step is a purposeful choice to seek out wisdom. In other words, I've been maybe even not aware of some of these things and not even paying attention, but at this point began to really focus in on some of these things that we've been missing and began to look at them in a bigger picture light. And one of the things that is helpful as we go through this process and as we're looking at these things in a bigger picture is to ask ourselves question of, what can I control? What can I influence? And the things that I can't control nor influence are things that I need to let go of. And for me, and I believe a number of people, one of the best ways to let go is through faith and being able to trust that we have a creator that loves us and that is wanting to take those things for us and, if you will, be in charge of those things. So letting go is part of the step of wisdom, because many things we cannot control, we can't even influence, but yet we continue to get focused on those things in our life. And what that does is it creates mental, emotional, even spiritual issues for us in that process. And it becomes a point of fear and anxiety and also discouragement. As we sit and focus on things that we can't control or influence, it becomes extremely discouraging. It causes us not to be able to have hope and move forward. And I like what Leslie says here, that another way to deal with some of the things we observe and to begin to grow into wisdom is the serenity prayer. And I would try to quote it, but I would butcher it. The upshot is, teach me to deal with the things that I can deal with, and for the things I can't, to accept them. And that is really what part of this process is about, is to, again, disconnect, figure out those things that are calling at us all the time that shouldn't be, and to observe in our life the things that we're not aware and that we really need to be aware of, and begin to give them attention, awareness. And most of all, as we begin to see the things in our life that we haven't been aware of that are actually affecting us, and quite often affecting us more than the things we get focused on, then we begin to get insight and begin to see the important things, and also people. We begin to understand those relationships that are important and valuable, and the ones that are not. And please understand, I'm not promoting that we become selfish in that all we do is face and deal with or incorporate in our lives the things that are about us. That's not it at all, because that's a very unwise thing to do. So let's see here. Lydia makes a comment, says, decluttering from the unnecessary distractions, seek clarity spiritually. Indeed, it is a way of decluttering. It helps us to begin to prioritize in accordance with our design and to begin to function in that way. And the value of that is, as we begin to function in the way we're supposed to, then it feeds on itself in that we are operating as designed, and we then avoid the things that do keep cluttering us, cluttering our lives and cluttering our thoughts. And it is a process that we need to work through. Leslie makes a comment, it's difficult but necessary to do one step at a time. It is, Leslie. In fact, if it were easy, we would be doing this a lot more often, and we wouldn't be facing the challenges that we face every day with things that we shouldn't even be dealing with. It is a problem that we have in that we have things and people that want to pull at us that really are not going to benefit us or them. Because if it's not something that we need to be involved in and have part of our life, ultimately it's not going to be good for the other people. And so it's not a selfish act, it's a self-care act that we're talking about. But it is needed as an intentional act. Again, I go back to the original comment I made earlier, is that many of us are going along and we're in autopilot. We're not really living. We're not experiencing life. We're going through the motions. We get up in the morning, we go to work, we do our work thing, then we come home, and then we do some home things, and it becomes a routine. And I get that there is certain value in routine, but it's not supposed to be to the point that it becomes almost like a prison for us. It is not designed for us to live like that. We are designed to live in a way that challenges us, that we face adversity and work through it. That's all part of what real life is about. And Leslie makes a comment, says, I have a passion and a purpose. Focusing on things out of my control distracts me from the reasons I do what I do. That is well put, Leslie. And that is a problem that many of us are not dealing with. Indeed, we are not walking or living in our purpose, our design. And that's a problem. Many of us, statistically, we find that we're not working in a job or vocation or whatever you want to call it that is aligned with our design and our purpose. And that's why a lot of people don't like going to work. Why we have so many people that are always living for the weekend, because they're miserable in what they're doing from a work standpoint. And that indicates a misalignment. And it's a real problem. And part of this 40-day challenge is a way to really look at that and consider, are we caught up in that? Are we caught up in living in a way that is not true to who we are designed to be and to what purpose we are designed for? And ultimately, Leslie mentions passion, and passion is part of it. Now, one caution about passion is if we get focused in on passion and not keep it in the context of our design and purpose, we can get misled by it, because passion is based in emotions, and emotions are great. It's a healthy part of who we are, but it is not the way we're designed to live and function in terms of making wise choices. A lot of wisdom is about learning how to sort through the emotional parts and understand what is healthy and what's not. That, and again, I'm not, people will try to say, oh, well, you're saying we need to ignore emotions. No, definitely not. Part of the problems we have today is people, especially, and I'm going to pick on men here, especially men, ignore emotional things in our life. And it's not healthy. It creates a problem for us as well as those around us. So again, part of this challenge, and 40 days, by the way, is not an accidental number, not a random number that I picked, but 40 days is a number related to trials and growth and challenge and adversity and overcoming. And so that's why 40 days is part of this, by the way. And so we go through this process. The other thing that comes out of the participating and practicing 40-day challenge is that it begins to help us set priorities. And see, one of the things that I learned a few years ago from a good friend, Gary Fry, I actually went up to a conference that Gary was hosting up in North Carolina. And one of the big takeaways from that for me was that not focusing on time management, but rather focusing on priority management. Because once we understand what our priorities really are and should be, then our time will follow accordingly, unless we are not lining up with those priorities. And as we begin to set those priorities, that helps us to identify our time. And as Leslie comments, I've learned the importance of setting boundaries to continue moving forward. Indeed, that's part of setting priorities or understanding priorities, because as we understand our priorities based in our design and our purpose, then we know how to set boundaries. And yes, we need to set boundaries. It's healthy. It's not a negative thing to tell people no. It is actually a very positive thing when we learn to say no based on our design and purpose, the priority of those things. Because again, if we say yes to things and to people that aren't part of our priority, for them, we're not going to do as well, not going to do a good job for as long. For us, it's going to take away from things that are part of our priority. It will cost us energy. It will even cause us to deal with things, adversities and challenges, maybe that we shouldn't be dealing with to start with. And so, yes, part of this challenge, as we again go through the 3 steps of disconnecting, observing, and then seeking wisdom, is helping us to understand priorities and to be able to set boundaries based on those priorities. And those boundaries are not a negative part of our life. It's actually very positive, not just for us, but for those around us, including those that we have to say no to. One of the interesting analogies is we look at cages. And a cage, depending on the circumstance, situation, and our attitude, can be something that constrains us and restricts us, or that same cage can be something that protects us. And it's a matter of addressing that in our attitudes and our minds to be able to have the right mindset in regards to it. An example, a cage, one form of a cage is prison, and it is very restrictive, and it's designed to be that way. And it is also actually, there's a protective aspect to it in that it protects us from other people that we're forced to be around that might do us harm. The same cage or jail does both things. A cage that we think about as that protects us is if some people study sharks and go on these shark adventures, and you're lowered into the water in a cage. The cage is there not to restrict you, not to make things hard on you, but rather it is there for your protection. So it's about how we approach it, and when we submit ourselves to cages versus not. Again, a lot of it's mindset and attitude. One of the best examples, and again, we're talking about setting boundaries as part of prioritizing, which comes out of this exercise of this 40-day challenge. But one of the examples I've liked is guardrails. When we're driving around in certain situations, we have these big metal structures that are guardrails on the side of roads. And we can look at guardrails in a couple of different fashions. We can look at guardrails as something that keeps us from getting off the road and going on adventures that are around the roads, and see them as very restrictive and something we don't like. On the other hand, we can see them as protection. And the reason that they're there is not generally to restrict us from learning and expanding our territory, so to speak, and adventuring. They're there for our protection, because if you'll notice, guardrails are primarily in places where that we are likely to have some kind of an accident and go off the road. And in particular, when we are driving on mountainous roads, we have guardrails because the consequence of going off the road in those cases can be devastating, deadly. And that's where guardrails exist. And they are there not to keep us from having adventure and having fun, however you want to look at it. They're there to protect us potentially from death. But if we always look at them and say, well, they won't let me get off the road, well, then we're going to see that negatively and as a problem. Whereas if we recognize the value of them and the safety they offer, it becomes reassuring. Actually, a few years ago, I was driving up Pikes Peak in Colorado, and there were places where there were no guardrails. And frankly, driving up that road in the areas with no guardrails, when you look to the side and see how it falls off and how dangerous it could be, not having the guardrails actually causes a little bit of uneasiness and a concern with being safe. And so it's about our mindset as we approach it. So to recap a bit, what we're talking about today is what I've called the 40-day challenge. And it's a process that I encourage us to consider to try on a daily basis for 40 days, but more importantly, is to be sure and become intentional about what we're doing, and to be intentional in seeking out wisdom. That is the important part, is that we begin to seek wisdom about our life, about things in our life, especially things that maybe we haven't paid attention to because we've been so remarkably distracted. And many of us today walk around very distracted. One of the distractions that we have in our life that it's a tool like many others, but it is easy to get us distracted is our cell phone. And in fact, it's amusing and sad that people now have video clips out where people are walking along paying too much attention to their cell phones, and they fall in fountains and run into signs, and even worse, sometimes walk out in front of cars or bump into people. And that's an example of one of those distracting types of things in our life that we really need to disconnect from, either short term, midterm, or long term. The key is once we begin to disconnect from them, even for a short period, it will help us to know, do we need to disconnect from them, and do so for longer periods or even permanently, and if we need to. And that will help us be healthier in the process. So let's see. Leslie makes a comment that I believe in reference to guardrails is they protect you as you do what you're interested in doing. And that she also comments that there's a reason that they're there. So the 40-day challenge, I encourage you to consider making it a part of your world for a time. And not just for the purpose, we have some rituals that we practice, religious rituals, where we give up something for a time. But generally, we do that. And most times, once the period of time for giving that up is passed, we end up not going back to whatever it is and continuing as if nothing had ever happened. What I'm hoping is that as we take on this 40-day challenge in our life, that it will begin to help us reevaluate. It will help us to begin to prioritize. It will help us to see the things that we can control and influence, and begin to purposely let go of those things we can't. And as we do this, we grow in the process, and ultimately, the bigger part of it is that it is a way to be intentional and in seeking out and gaining wisdom. I'm curious for anyone that is watching with us today, whether it's on LinkedIn or Facebook or YouTube, what are some things that you need to consider, or a thing to start with that you need to consider to disconnect from, at least temporarily? What are those things for you? My personal example was disconnecting from news media in particular. And as part of that and related is television watching. I no longer watch live television. And it was a interesting choice because I had been accustomed to watching it and experiencing it. What's been fascinating as I made those choices to disconnect, it has affected my life in a very positive sense, in that one, it has taken away something in my life that causes anxiety and upset. Watching the news and even watching advertisements and things had become very upsetting for a number of reasons. And by disconnecting from it, that's something that keeps me from having to deal with those anxieties, those fears, even when I shouldn't have to. I don't need to because it's not necessary. It doesn't keep me from functioning as a human and being there for other people. Welcome, Lee. Welcome, Richard. Glad to have you with us today. And Jane makes a comment, says, knowledge never stops. We thrive when we continue learning. Indeed, uh, one of the things that I have purposely done in my life, part of it's because I'm just a very curious kind of person. I love to learn and find out new things, and especially I like to know how and why things work. And so learning is very important. The challenge that we have about learning, though, is that we spend a lot of time picking up knowledge and stopping there. And that is part of the challenge that we face today is we've got so much information in our minds that maybe is not necessary or not a priority in our life for us to live and function the way we should as who we are and to do so most effectively. So let's see here. Rick makes a comment. And by the way, I love you guys making comments, asking questions. That makes this podcast so much better than me just monologuing. I can talk a long time because I guess because I've learned a lot and experienced a lot. But anyway, I really like the comments. If you want to get depressed, watch the nightly news. I turned it off a year ago. I still watch what's going on in the world. Indeed, disconnecting doesn't mean that it's a way or a reason to hide our head in the sands at all. In fact, what will happen is as we disconnect from distractions and disconnect from things that are not critical, not priority in our lives, then we begin to gain a clarity and understanding about what is going on. And in fact, again, the ultimate goal of this process is to gain wisdom. And I assure you that if you gain wisdom and operate from that, you will do much, much better than just exposing yourself or us exposing ourselves to information constantly. We don't need all of the information that is out there that we can expose ourselves to. And overexposure to this information, this knowledge, can actually be detrimental to us. And the key that we have to be is intentionality in that process. That's part of this 40-day challenge, is to help us to become intentional in considering what is priority and what we expose ourselves to. Jane makes a comment, wisdom for most comes with age and experience. As we contemplate life more deeply, we gain wisdom and a deeper insight into understanding God. Well put, Jane. It is so true. What's really interesting to me is as we go out, we all know some people that don't have to or haven't had to wait until they are old to gain some wisdom. And the one thing that I have noticed is that quite often those that are younger that have gained wisdom are one of two likely categories. One is that they have parents that are in their life to share with them about wisdom, and the person is open to learning that wisdom. That's one. The other, and this is more common, is that people at even young ages that have to face adversity. It could be physical adversity, mental or emotional adversity, a lot of different types of adversity. But what we see is as a result, we will go, wow, you are wise beyond your years. Well, I get that, and I appreciate the observation there with that. The challenge or the insight that I think we can walk away from is that we don't have to wait until we are older to gain wisdom. And that's something that unfortunately in our culture is plaguing us, is that we became a and as a purposeful act dating back to the 70s or 80s, is that we have become a knowledge-based society or culture. That's not accidental. The problem with it is, as we talk about on this show, this podcast, is knowledge is not the stopping place. It's the beginning place. And it is important that we not stop there. In fact, what happens is that we see is people that gain a lot of knowledge and never progress into growing into wisdom quite often become arrogant, become puffed up, self-centered, prideful, whatever term you like. And those are all unhealthy approaches in our life. And so it's a challenge. Let's see, Richard makes a comment that he's been struggling with the lack of civility overall, and especially in the marketplace. Unfortunately, Richard, it is rampant. And part of this, frankly, from my vantage point, is because we are not seeking out wisdom that we need to function. Because when we become wise, we begin to understand our lives and the lives of others from a bigger picture. We are more likely to become civil, because uncivility, I'm not sure which is appropriate or correct, but a lack of civility has consequences. And when we gain wisdom, we begin to realize what happens when we become uncivil, because we look beyond our immediate self and only our self-interest. Again, the part of the value of wisdom is taking us beyond just ourselves. That's the huge step. And when we do that, we are more likely to make choices that are healthier for us, because we see that bigger picture, because we make choices in light of that, rather than making choices based on what is happening in the moment only, and then realizing that we didn't make the best choice because there are other consequences involved. So let's see. Leslie makes a comment, says, news, certain TV shows, and constant checking of my cell phone. More focus on doing what is important to me. I've always had a yearning for learning about things outside of my field. I am all about a healthy sense of curiosity and learning. I think we all do well to make that a part of who we are. And I believe in some regards that we are designed to be curious and want to learn, because that is part of keeping ourselves mentally, emotionally, and spiritually healthier, is by ongoing learning and growth. If we're not learning and growing, we're generally backing up, so to speak, or losing time, or whatever you want to say. And Lydia makes a comment, and this is a important part. We're much more peaceful and happier when we begin to, first of all, gain wisdom. Because when we gain wisdom, we make choices, wise choices, that keep us from doing things that hurt our peacefulness, our happiness. And it also, as we begin to make wise choices and see things well and behave accordingly, we can even learn how to live with contentment, which is something that so many lack today because of all of the things pulling at us, the distractions and other things that are demanding our attention. And Lydia makes a comment, detach from all distractions and attachments. Indeed, it doesn't mean that we disconnect and become unengaged. at, at all, because being engaged and a part of what we're doing is what we're designed for. Excuse me. Our very design is to be engaged, but we're not designed to be engaged and involved in everything with everybody. And I think part of the reason that we're to a point where that is a priority is we think that it is necessary to be a well-rounded person. See, being well-rounded is not what we're designed to be. We are designed to be very unique. And I do not need to know or do certain things to be valuable as a person and to be true to what and who I am designed to be with the purpose that I have as part of that design. So, again, the value of this is to start by disconnecting. Pick one thing, whatever that one thing that you think is the biggest distraction for you, and try disconnecting. Try it briefly. And then with this 40-day challenge, it gives us a kind of an outline to be able to go, okay, for 40 days, I'm going to disconnect from something, whatever that is. But don't just disconnect, because what our goal is not the act of disconnecting. The goal is the ultimate outcome of gaining the wisdom. So we're not disconnecting to run away from something. We are disconnecting to run to something. And that something we are running to is wisdom. And it's very interesting that one of the wisest people that we think of and throughout history is Solomon, King Solomon. I think most everybody would say that King Solomon was wise, and that as a result, he experienced a lot of things, most of it good, some bad. But one of the key things that Solomon made a choice, rather than choosing to receive wealth and prosperity or other things, he chose to have wisdom and to gain wisdom. The result, by the way, was that the other things that he needed and even wanted became a part of his life as a result of being wise. And so wisdom is where we need to go as a person, both for ourselves and for other people. The more we learn to be wise and to behave from a place of wisdom, our world changes, our effect on others changes in a positive sense. And Leslie makes a comment that it's something positive, something that helps us to refocus. That's the goal of this 40-day challenge, is not to cause us to, the focus is not to what we give up, but more to what we gain. And what we gain through the process ultimately is more wisdom. And the more wisdom we gain, the healthier and happier and more fulfilled, or even experiencing abundance, is a result. Jane makes a comment. I love it, Kevin. I haven't watched TV for over 16 years. It makes all the difference. I live much more at peace. I agree. In fact, what I will challenge you, those of you that choose to take on the 40-day challenge and you disconnect from TV and media in that sense, after doing that for 40 days, and then you go back and begin to expose yourself to it again, watch your reaction. It's remarkable. I have been away from it for so long that now when I get exposed to live TV and news and things like that, I start getting very anxious and agitated pretty quickly. And and if that's the case, that means that for so long we've lived anxious and agitated and thought that was normal. And it's not. That is not what we are supposed to do. That is not healthy. So part of this process, in addition to gaining wisdom, is to also help us find out what is really good and healthy for us and begin to experience it so that we're no longer getting by or just having a good or living good or whatever, but we're moving into a place of excellence and a place of joy, a place of abundance, a place of contentment and peace by figuring out what it is that is priority for us and learning to understand that there are some things out there that are there in and of themselves, may be good or bad. They're just a thing, a tool, if you will. But finding out if that is something that is getting in the way for us to go from good to being excellent. And in fact, one of the sayings that I like is that good is the enemy of excellence. And I think many of us are now to a point we're so satisfied with good, we don't know what excellent is in our life. And so we don't even know what we're missing. And this exercise, if you do it well and commit to it, it can help you begin to find out, are you just living and getting by? Or can you, by making some choices, gaining wisdom, begin to go from good and getting by to excellent and abundance and positive? And I know, please, some people say, oh, well, people that are always trying to be positive are just looking at life through rose-colored glasses. Not at all what I'm referring to. One of the things that is value of gaining wisdom is I have a better sense of reality and what's going on in my life and in the world and lives of those around me in such a way that that it is keenly better. And it helps me to be clearer as I begin to prioritize better, as Lydia puts it, to make room for new skills or hobbies that benefit us. And by the way, when things benefit us, and if we are living wisely, they also benefit others, especially those others in our lives. Part of the challenge and part of the reason we have relationship problems is because we are not functioning the way we should. And as a result, we're not being who we need to be for those around us. So I'm not talking about becoming selfish and self-centered, talking about self-care and how to be healthy because of the benefit it brings to others as well. Indeed, Leslie, I agree that as we go through these processes and we gain wisdom and disconnect, that it reduces stress and increases peace. And again, I encourage you, if you're skeptical, I appreciate that. Healthy skepticism is a good thing. By the way, welcome, Professor Jagdish. I'm sorry I saw you pop up earlier, and I apologize for not recognizing you. Appreciate you being here. And once you go through this process and you begin to reprioritize based on your design, your purpose, once you do that, and then you go back to some of these things that you've disconnected from, you go, wow, how in the world did I even live and live well with all this stuff and being exposed to it and so on. And yes, Leslie, part of the value is that it helps us to look at what's going on inside of us. Unfortunately, in our culture, and just by the nature that we live in a physical world, we quite often forget about the internal. And the reality is the internal is really us. It's not the body that we're walking in that is us. The real us is internal, and in my opinion, is eternal, and something that is important. And when we get caught up and we're in autopilot, so many times we miss what's going on inside because we're so focused on what's going on outside. And what's sad is that the things going on outside of us are the things quite often we can't control nor influence. And we ignore what's going on inside us, which we can quite often control and influence more. Professor Jagdish makes comments. The challenge is to convert data into useful information, then information to knowledge, and then knowledge to wisdom. Professor Jagdish, well put. We are in a culture where we are taking on so much data. It's there. I mean, again, you can Google and get all kind of data, but as long as it's just information rolling around in our heads, it is just that. It's data, and data by itself it just clutters things up. It has no value. But you take that data and you begin to interpret it and put it in context, then it can become very helpful. And then once we begin to interpret the data, understanding and experience, then if we begin to interpret it and see that data in the context of the bigger world, see it in the context outside of myself as well as inside myself. Remember, part of the 40-day challenge, the observe part of that challenge is not just looking outwardly, but it is to look inwardly, as I believe it was Leslie that mentioned. Let's see. I want to not miss any comments. And Leslie, I appreciate that you are, this seems to be resonating with you, and glad to hear it, because at the end of the day, this podcast is not about me. It's not about me getting attention or anything else. It's all about helping others to, first of all, begin the process of seeking wisdom. And then second of all, to begin to gain the wisdom they're seeking. And so it's really what this podcast is about. And if I'm aware that it's allowing someone to make those steps in that direction, it really is great. Leslie, I believe, shares the Serenity Prayer for those of you that don't know. And this is a very great prayer. And by the way, I think is a good part to include in our 40-day challenge process. And Jane shares another version of the same concept. At the end of the day, it is about learning, excuse me, to understand what we can control and begin to gain insight into it and seek wisdom how to deal with the things we can control. Another is the things we maybe cannot control, but we can influence. Again, this process helps us to gain that insight. And the most important part, and I think this is the part we're missing, and Jane's view on how to approach it, the serenity approach, is so true, and that's the faith part. And the faith part helps us when we realize that the things we can't control or influence, sometimes it's hard to let go of them. And that's where our faith comes in, is that we can let go, and simplistically let go and let God. So we just need to be mindful. And I encourage everyone to consider taking up this challenge. Not for me, not for benefit of this podcast or anything else. This is for each of you. And I really look forward to coming back, because 40 days from now we'll be getting close to the new year. It would be outstanding to hear what has happened as a result of participating in this 40-day challenge. Just for those that may be joining us latter part here, the 40-day challenge we're talking about is a 3-step process that I hope each of you will choose to implement in your day-to-day for 40 days. And that is to disconnect from the things that are distracting you, whatever that is. Pick one thing and disconnect. And then while you're disconnected from it, the additional time and energy, begin to observe outwardly what's going on in your world around you, not necessarily the bigger world, because very little of that can we control or influence, but what's going on around you, and observe what's going on inside you. Once you begin to make these observations, then the next step is to seek out wisdom. What can I learn? What can I get a new perspective, a better perspective about the things I observe? And how can I see those things outside of myself and understand it in a bigger picture, and in spiritual terms, to begin to see these things that I observe and see them through God's eyes, which means actually understanding them in light of who we're designed to be and what purpose we have. So I challenge you, consider taking this 40-day challenge in your life. See what happens. I think you will be pleasantly surprised ultimately with the outcome, if nothing else, that it will bring about peace, joy, and abundance in our life that we're intended to have to start with. So thank you, everyone. Sorry I'm over a couple of minutes, but thank you for being here. Have an amazing week. Be blessed. And we'll come back together next Monday to again seek and gain wisdom together. God bless you. Bye.